Now that we've created hierarchies, let's take a closer look at the best practice warnings. Even though we were instructed to create a hierarchy, adding a hierarchy did not remove the warnings. Let's take a look. It tells us to avoid visible attribute hierarchies for attributes used as levels in user-defined hierarchies. So this hierarchy in the center, this is considered the user-defined hierarchy. And each of these items here, even though the names match our attribute names, if you look at the properties window, you can see that each of these are levels. And each level is associated with an attribute. So it's telling us if we're going to use an attribute in a level, then we need to hide those attributes from the user so that the user would not be able to select calendar year, month, or quarter as individual items for browsing purposes. And we may or may not agree with that. If you have a large number of members, maybe you have 1 million customers, then maybe it makes sense to hide those values. But in the case of calendar time, maybe that particular warning is not as relevant. So what we can do is we can ignore that particular warning. And we can do that on a dimension by dimension basis. To do that, we'd open up the error list window, which will display down towards the bottom. And we need to find the error as associated with the date dimension. If we don't see the error, we just go ahead and deploy. We need to deploy to get the latest version of warnings set up in our error list, which is available from the View menu. Then we can search for the date dimension here. We can see the error, avoid visible attribute hierarchies for attributes used as levels in user-defined hierarchies. So if we want to ignore that, we would right-click on that particular error and select Dismiss. And as we dismiss it, we can include a comment to explain why we're dismissing it, which is helpful when we have multiple database developers so that we can document the changes for one another. So we click OK. That dismisses the warning and removes it from the error list. So the warnings are there just for guidance. They will not stop us from deploying and using the cube. So we've cleared the error on the date dimension, but we still have an error on the hierarchy itself. So when we point to it, it tells us that attribute relationships don't exist for this particular dimension. And we'll deal with that error in a separate demonstration in this module. If we go to the product dimension, we can see that we again have the avoid visible attribute hierarchies for attributes used as levels, and we have another error, define attribute relationships as rigid where appropriate. We'll deal with these particular warnings also later when we talk about attribute relationships in this module. Now, if I want to eliminate a particular warning globally, that is for the entire database, so that I don't have to continue dismissing the same type of warning over and over again, I can go to the database menu and select Edit Database. And then there's a tab here for warnings that shows me all of the warnings that are possible within my cube or for data sources or for databases and so forth. So I can decide that on a global basis, I want to eliminate certain kinds of warnings. Now, it's a good idea to keep these warnings in place until you have a firm understanding of the principles behind each of these design warnings, and then can make an informed decision about whether or not it's wise to ignore those warnings. So here's our warning, avoid visible attribute hierarchies for attributes used as levels in user-defined hierarchies, and I can just clear that checkbox, and so any dimensions that currently get that warning will no longer display that warning. And you can see that this is a low importance, so it's relatively safe to ignore this. Most of these warnings are to guide us towards an optimal cube, one that performs well for queries, as well as one that performs well for processing purposes. Notice down below we have the dismissed warning, so when we've dismissed warnings one by one in the error list, we can see the collection of those warnings appear here on this Database Designer on the Warnings tab, as well as the comments that are associated with it. If I decide later that I want to have this warning apply, I can re-enable the warning that has been previously dismissed. And that's how we work with best practice warnings.